don't mind. And what shocked me yesterday was that the Chancellor delivered a budget that so clearly failed to address the desperate needs of our society after 8 years of austerity. Let's just look at some elements of the human cost of austerity and what the Chancellor brought forward in the budget. If you're
I thank him for giving way. With the number crunching that he's undoubtedly been doing, has he worked out how much more would have been available for the police, prisons, schools, local government if the UK had not voted to leave the European Union 2.5 years ago? And does he not believe that that reinforces the case for a people's vote now to restore the level of growth that we saw 2.5 years ago?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, I respect his views on Brexit because I campaign for Remain as well. But it behoves any Liberal Democrat to come to this House with a bit of humility after serving with a Tory administration that savaged our public services. Let me look at some of the elements of human suffering. If you're a health worker, you're having to cope with the biggest financial squeeze in the NHS history.
Would the honourable gentleman give way? Does the honourable gentleman agree with me that we absolutely must reinstate nursing bursaries if we are to see the number of nurses we need in our NHS?
It's an essential element of the, I suppose, the reconstruction that Labour will have to do when we come to power.
That's right.
The IFS has said that a rise in health spending of 3.3% was needed just to maintain the current stretched service, and at least 4% to improve that. Instead, what we got amounts, according to the Nuffield Trust, is just 2.7% in real terms next year of overall health spending.
Yes, that's right.
If you're a police officer, you'll have seen over 21,000 of your colleagues' jobs cut since 2010. And as a result, violent crime is on the rise. And the independent police watchdog are warning that the lives of vulnerable people could be at risk. And what did they get yesterday? 160 million for counter-terrorism, far less than what is needed, and not a penny more for neighbourhood policing. And this despite the head of counter-terrorism warning that their work relies on properly funding regular policing. If you're a teacher, your pay has fallen by 4% since 2011. And the school's budgets have been cut by £3 billion in real terms. 36,000 teachers left the profession, the highest since records began.
Does he agree with me that the cuts to education, which have left Wallasey schools, 22 out of 26 of them facing cuts, and seen £3 million cut from our budgets, whilst teachers are earning £4,000 less a year and having to do more, is an absolute disgrace, and it demonstrates that this government gives no priority whatsoever to the future of our children.
Exactly. Exactly. The honourable member has got it exactly. But it takes something, doesn't it, to actually have head teachers marching on Downing Street? Never seen before. Just what did yesterday's budget do to tempt teachers back? Well, what the Chancellor offered was little extras. It was an insult. And especially when 60% of teachers aren't getting a pay rise this year. There are now 4 million children living in poverty. 500 children's centres closed, 500 children's playgrounds closed, 128,000 children living in temporary accommodation. And when children's social care face a funding gap of £3 billion by 2025, what did the Chancellor offer them? £84 million to just 20 councils. It's not even going to scratch the surface of the problem. We have the record number. No, we have the record number. We have a record number of children coming into care. I know what it seems for a child coming into care. They're scarred for life. And why are they coming to care? Because there's been a 40% cut in the funding to councils on early intervention to support families. Let them justify that. For young people, the YMCA reports that spending on youth service has fallen 62% since 2010. The average graduate comes out of university, has a £50,000 debt. The IFS describes home ownership amongst young people having collapsed completely. And you know, tragically, with mounting pressure, a decades-long decline in suicides amongst men has been reversed since 2010. To make the honourable gentleman, I think, certainly.
Grateful to the honourable member for giving way, particularly mentioning suicide. I'm wondering if there's anything in this budget he can welcome. I appreciate we may differ. Would he not welcome the announcement on mental health, or perhaps the announcement of a £21 million Centre of Excellence for public sector leaders?
I would look on this issue. Of course, we would welcome more money, but what has been required is £4 billion, not £2 billion. And that £2 billion is contained within the £20 billion already announced. It isn't additional money. There are some things that we work in this House on a cross-party basis, but we have to be honest about the needs. We have to be honest about the requirements that there are, and we have to be, I think, straightforward in saying how that can be funded. I'll give it.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, but he's being a little unfair. Some people have done very well from austerity. 1,000 of the richest people in the United Kingdom have seen their personal wealth increase by £274 billion over the last 5 years.
The facts speak for themselves. To make a real difference to the lives of young people, the Chancellor needed to address the housing crisis, deal with the toppling mountain of student loans, restore work allowances for single people and couples without children, and instead we got piecemeal, unambitious housing announcements and re-announcements, nothing on student finances and nothing for universal credit recipients who are single without children.
Thank you. I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. The Chancellor's meagre contributions back towards universal credit will do nothing to reverse the social security cuts to disabled people. Does he agree with me that for the millions of disabled people, austerity is far from over?
I'll come on to the plight of disabled people, which seem to have been a particular target for this government. In the way in which they've withdrawn funding and services. It's true. But for older people, there were over 31,000 excess winter deaths amongst the over 65s in 2017. Well over 150,000 elderly people are in arrears on their social care payments. The 1.5 billion was needed for 2020 just to fund the funding gap in adult social care, described by the LGA on a cross-party basis. The £650 million announced yesterday is less than half of that. And you know what's come out of the analysis is that the burden of austerity has fallen disproportionately on who? The shoulders of women. And yesterday that didn't just continue, it got worse. The share of the government's tax and benefit changes impacting upon women increased from 86 to 87%, another year of an increase. And yes, in the 1950s, women have been treated so unjustly, looked over, yes, once again. The victims of possibly the harshest cruelty inflicted by this government, yes, have been disabled people. A UN inquiry into the rights of persons with disabilities has found this government guilty, and let me quote, of the grave and systematic violations of their human rights. Whenever have any UK government been charged with that by a UN body? Never. And to be frank, we know, I've given the way to the honourable gentleman once, many have taken their own lives as a result of the welfare reforms imposed upon them since 2010. And the government...
Order, I apologise for interrupting the honourable gentleman. The honourable gentleman from Croydon South has made his point with force and alacrity, but he shouldn't witter from a sedentary position, engaged in an animated conversation with a member on the opposite benches, and the same goes for both sides. I must say the Shadow Chancellor has addressed the House, as in my experience he invariably has done, with very considerable courtesy. And whatever people think of what is being said, people should extend courtesy to the front bench speakers as to the back. John MacDonald.
Mr. Speaker, I understand the Honourable Gentleman. He gets excited at times, but as someone who has been excited myself at times, I completely understand.
Young John MacDonald here.
The government, on disabled people, let me just return. The government have been repeatedly forced by the courts to change how they are treating disabled people. They don't seem to have learnt their lesson yet. So yesterday we saw no restoration of disability premiums, no end to the cruel social security freeze, and no end to dehumanising and unreliable work capability assessments. The government is also putting the livelihoods of future generations at risk. A few weeks ago, the world's leading authority on climate change said the avoiding of dangerous climate change would require, and they quote, a rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented action. What did we get yesterday? No mention of climate change, no reversal of cuts to renewable energy, no significant environmental policy. Yes, I will.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. I'm just curious, the other day the government voted through a £650 million scheme to improve energy efficiency and home insulation. Why did the party opposite vote against it?
It wasn't good enough.
Because it was not of a scale that would even impact upon the level. But you know, it's interesting, Mr. Speaker. I welcome interventions, but I think we should have a rule that when people make an intervention, they should describe their background as an advisor to George Osborne, who cut back on the solar energy industry, who undermined wind power in this country, and set us back so we'll never meet our climate change targets. The impact of... Calm down, calm down. It was a mechanism. It was a mechanism that George Osborne used to treat on me, saying, calm down. And I said, I'll calm down when you resign, and he did. The impact on the self-employed and small businesses has been equally stark. 51,000 high street stores closed last year. Wages for the self-employed have collapsed to around the same level as they were 20 years ago. Yesterday...
Does he agree with me that it was a disgrace that yesterday we heard they are going to save the high street by turning our shops into residential properties and risking the very fundamentals of how the high street operates?
That's right. See, the Honourable Gentleman is right. Yesterday we needed serious action to address the bias against high streets which have led to so many empty shops. Instead, we got legislation which will help turn shops into flats. Not yet. And we then had a huge media presentation about an online tax being introduced. 400 million will be found from this online tax in a few years' time. At the weekend, the Tax Justice Campaign said these top 5 tech companies have avoided £5 billion worth of tax. But my second concern about the austerity debate is, if you understand and appreciate what people have been forced to go through with austerity, only callous complacency would drive you to inflict these policies on people. Yesterday, the Chancellor's speech with reference to Labour's recession, it demonstrated how he's trapped in a time warp of a political propaganda exercise by the Tories a decade ago.
Take responsibility for
I thought they'd like that one, Mr. Speaker. Let's be clear. The financial crash was the result of greed and speculation and regulation that goes right back to the 1980s. Austerity, you know, was always a bad idea.
I thank the Honourable Friend for giving way. Like my honourable friend, I heard the Chancellor try to blame the last Labour government for the recession. But in actual fact, the previous Chancellor actually said a couple of months ago it wasn't the Labour government's fault, it was the whole system's fault, and starting with Lehman Brothers in America. Let's get the facts right. Yeah.
See, I always said George Osborne would get it right one day. I will in due course, if that's okay, honourable lady. Okay. Let's be absolutely clear. Thanks a lot. The consensus among economists and the evidence of recent history is absolutely clear. The worst possible response to a recession is for a government to cut its own spending. In a recession, the government should be there to support businesses and households. Instead, at the moment, the government's support was needed most to help people back on their feet. Conservative chancellors chose to impose the most severe spending cuts in generations. They didn't have to, and they shouldn't have done. The Tories were warned austerity would lead to slower growth and lower wages, and it has. The economic experts that the Tories chose to ignore were proved right. Growth since the financial crisis under Conservative chancellors has been the slowest from any recession in modern times. Real weekly average earnings today are still lower than they were in 2010. The Resolution Foundation reports this morning that real wages will not have fully recovered until 2024. 10 years after the crash, we should be clear about the causes of the financial crisis. The Chancellor seemed very confused on the point yesterday. It wasn't the deficit that caused the crisis, but the crisis that caused the deficit. It was a crisis. It was a crisis. They don't like to hear the truth. It was a crisis that resulted from the casino economy the Tories helped to construct right from the 1980s. And they supported it every way.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and he asked us to give our personal history. Well, I was a proud public sector employee for 17 years, and I take issue with the way that Labour wrecked the economy and spent money he did not have. Would he like to tell us how he proposes to pay for his current funding system?
Here's an answer. It's called a fair taxation system. It was the ideology. It was the ideology of neoliberalism that said markets were always right, that regulation was simply a barrier to growth, and that ultimately greed was good. The financial system this ideology helped design collapsed 10 years ago. It was the Conservative chancellors who took the political decision to force working people, not the bankers, to pay the price for it. The result, Mr. Speaker, you'll admit that I've been generous in the amount of times I've given way. So I suggest, because you have a large number of speakers, particularly on this side, that I press on. The result has been a period of stagnation unprecedented in modern history. A period of falling wages, crumbling public services, insecurity in the economy, visibly failing across great swathes of this country. And because the cuts are still, even now, grinding on, the stagnation will continue, as the official forecasts say. Investment forecasts have been revised downwards across the OBR's forecast periods. Real wages will barely recover. Growth will remain far below its long-run trend. And the Chancellor can't use Brexit as an excuse for these dismal figures. The OBR presented its forecast on the basis of what it called, and I quote, a relatively smooth exit from the EU next year. But the Tories are bungling the Brexit negotiations. It's been so bad that the economy is being impacted upon now. Investment has been delayed, has even been cancelled. Britain already has the lowest rate of business investment in the G7, and even that has fallen this year. It's the uncertainty the Tories have introduced into the whole process that is so terrifying business people. They just know, they want to know where they stand. But that uncertainty was even made worse yesterday. Yesterday morning, the Chancellor has taken to threatening to revoke his own budget in the event of a no-deal Brexit. Yet on the very morning of his own budget, his own Prime Minister was contradicting him. How can any company looking ahead to invest in Britain not look at this and wonder where we are headed? In well over 2 years, the government has spent more time negotiating with itself than with our European partners. With the date of leaving the EU just 5 months away, time is running out to present a deal that would respect the result of the referendum and could win the support of the House. Instead, as the Tories continue to indulge in their squabbling, the economy and the whole country are being confronted with a grim prospect of a no-deal car crash. I've asked the Chancellor before to rule out a no-deal Brexit. A responsible Chancellor wouldn't support this and wouldn't, as he has done before, idly threaten to mutate this country into some form of tax haven off the coast of Europe. Mr. Speaker, let's put on record. Let's put on record. Austerity is not ending. In the weeks and months ahead, people will recognise that the Prime Minister's promise has been broken. Do you know there are rumours that this was possibly a pre-election budget with pre-election tax giveaways? If the Conservatives are contemplating a general election, let me say on behalf of the Labour Party, bring it on!
The question is as on the order paper. I call the Secretary of State for Health, Secretary Matt Hancock.
Well, Mr. Speaker, yesterday's budget proved the time-honoured truth that careful stewardship of the economy, taking difficult decisions, creating the environment for enterprise, generating growth leads to better days, not just for those with the dignity of employment now in record number who didn't in the past, but also for the provision of our public services on which we all depend. This budget reported record jobs, unemployment lower than in a generation, more full-time jobs, the lowest proportion of low-paid jobs for 2 decades, and rising real pay, with the fastest rises in real pay coming amongst the lowest paid in our society, thanks to our national living wage. And we have just seen, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the big difference between these front benches. While we're delivering more jobs and more opportunity and more prosperity, all the front bench opposite promises is more borrowing and more taxes and more debt. We just heard it again from the Shadow Chancellor. No ideas for the future, just talking Britain down. And there's a big difference in this Parliament between a party that believes in the future and a front bench opposite who would only take us back. The programme the Right Honourable Gentleman proposes, whenever it's been tried anywhere in the world, has led to bankruptcy and misery for millions, and you can't fund public services on that. Because the thing is, without a strong economy, you can't fund an NHS that everyone can turn to in their hour of need. Whether it's a life-threatening condition, Mr. Deputy Speaker, or just when you fall over some fly tipping. We're only able to put the record funding into our NHS because of the millions more people in work, earning more and paying their taxes. And I'll certainly give way.
Thank the Secretary of State for giving way. On that point, could I thank him for his work in securing the public capital for the Midland Metropolitan Hospital in Sandwell, which had some difficulties following the collapse of Carillion. Him working with the Chief Executive and the Board of the Trust has secured the future of that hospital, which is now on track to be built, which will be a very vital resource for my local area in Raleigh Regis.
Well, I pay tribute to my honourable friend who has worked so hard to get the hospital back on track. It's now being built again because we have put in the capital, because we have it in the NHS budget, and we put it into the NHS budget because we've had to rescue it from the failed PFI invented by the party opposite. And it's only because we have a strong economy that we can give the NHS the longest, largest cash injection ever in its history. And if he will welcome that injection, then I'll give way to the right honourable gentleman.
To the Secretary of State giving way, he's talking about the rises in health spending. He's Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. Can you tell us over the next 5 years how much social care expenditure is going to rise by?
Yes, I'm going to come on to social care because yesterday we put a further £650 million into social care, and we're coming forward with reforms to social care to put it on a sustainable footing for the long term. And I'll give way over here.
Very grateful. I want to ask the Secretary of State for Health about acquired brain injury, because we save so many lives now. But if we put significant investment up front to make sure that everybody gets the right neuro-rehabilitation, we can save vast amounts of money for the taxpayer. Isn't that actually rather a good model for us to pursue?
Yes, and I think that this constructive approach that the honourable gentleman has taken on this subject over many months with me and years before shows the progress we can make. We're putting £20.5 billion extra into the NHS, and when you're making an uplift like that, you can turn the resources towards preventing ill health in exactly the sort of way that he describes, and I pay tribute to the work that he's done on this subject. I'll give way.
I'm grateful to the Health Secretary for giving way. Yesterday, the Chancellor boasted of a jobs miracle. If there's a jobs miracle, why is the chemotherapy unit at King George Hospital closing because of a shortage of chemotherapy nurses?
Well, we have a plan to improve the cancer workforce and to try to solve some of these problems. But maybe he should come over onto this side and work with us to put record funding into the NHS. And you can only have record funding for the NHS if you have a strong economy. I'll certainly give way.
Isn't it absolutely critical that every single penny put into the NHS is well spent to tackle waste and bureaucracy, unlike what happened when Labour was in charge, where almost half wasn't spent on patient care?
He's absolutely right that people want to see more funding for our NHS, and they're going to get it. But they also want to see all of that money well spent. The budget confirms that the NHS is the government's #1 spending priority, just as it is the British people's #1 spending priority. And this budget places the government foursquare in the centre of British politics. It's progressive and optimistic and focused on the future, not just for the many, but for the whole country that we serve.
Thank the Secretary of State for giving way, and of course absolutely welcome the uplift to NHS funding. But could he just answer a small technical point, please, on the Red Book, where we have separate entries for the increase in the Ardell for health and for NHS England? Could he confirm that difference of 6.3 billion versus 7.2 billion won't result in a transfer from Public Health England or Health Education England or capital budgets in order to fund that discrepancy? Because that has happened in the past.
Yes, I can confirm that. The 20.5 billion real terms funding for the NHS, which is in the budget, is for the NHS itself and will be channelled through NHS England. Of course, there are budgets in the department that are outside the NHS envelope, and they will be settled in the spending review. This is exactly as has been planned and was made clear in June. The key point is, and I can tell the House, that the 20.5 billion is both the longest and the largest settlement for any public service in the history of this country. Yes, I'll give way.
I'm grateful to the Secretary of State, and you know, we need to be precise and we need to be accurate. And I've just Googled the settlement, and in fact, the biggest ever increase in NHS funding happened between 1997 and 2008, when the budget went up from 55 billion to 125.4 billion. I mean, that's the well. You know, I'm talking about being factually correct, and the biggest ever funding increase came under a Labour government. Let's be honest about it.
No, this is a single settlement for a 5-year period, so that the NHS can plan again. And I'll make a little progress. Because, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I did receive some representations on what we should do for funding the NHS. We received one representation from a John from Hillingdon, and he called for a 2.2% increase in funding. And John said, and I quote, that this would make the NHS the envy of the world. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, while others might preach a gospel of envy, we're getting on with building the NHS to be there for us all, and I can tell the House the £20 billion increase that I've been talking about is not just a 2.2% increase per year, it's 3.4% more a year over the next 5 years. And I'll give way.
Can I thank the Minister for giving way, and can I acknowledge the contribution he's made to providing the funding for the Midlands Metro Hospital, which is very important to people in the Black Country. However, there are cumulative debts of something like £7.5 billion for an NHS hospital trust, plus a further £5 billion or so other debts. Can he give reassurance that the £20.5 million won't be used predominantly just for paying our debts and will provide additional extra services?
Well, the 20.5 is just the day-to-day running cost, the resource cost. Of course, there's a capital budget as well. And the capital budget, which includes £4 billion of taxpayers' money, goes towards ensuring that we can get the capital built. And so the critical point is that not only have we got the uplift in the running costs of 20.5 billion, but we've also got a capital budget, and we'll be making further announcements on the allocation of the capital budget later in the autumn.
I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. I'm also grateful for him for clarifying this 20.5 billion, which doesn't include training or capital, and it also contradicts, of course, what Downing Street unhelpfully briefed during the summer, that it was somewhere near 84 billion. Will he confirm that that figure of 84 billion, which has been repeated on media, is, in the words of the Health Service Journal, a fib, and we are talking about 20.5 billion purely for that narrow resource on the NHS in England and Wales?
No. The 84 billion is the cash figure. The 84 billion is the cash figure. The 20.5 is the real terms increase by the end of the 5 years. So if you add up all of the extra money, then you get to 84 billion. It's there on page 36 of the budget if she wants to look. And the biggest single cash increase comes next year in 2019-20. So it's all there. It's all in the red book. I'll give way over there.
Can I thank the Secretary of State very much for giving way, and can I thank him for more good news for the Midlands in relation to the £70 million which is being given to the national bit to help civilian rehabilitation at the Defence National Rehabilitation Centre just outside my Loughborough constituency. I don't know if the Secretary has any further details that he's able to share to expand on that.
Well, I pay tribute again to my right honourable friend who has worked tirelessly in support of this project. The National Rehabilitation Centre in Loughborough will link the world-class military medical facility with our NHS. So it means that the lessons that have been learned in the medical field from treating our brave troops coming back from the front line will then can be brought into the NHS, so that surgical techniques, for instance, that have been learnt in battle can then be adapted to help civilians here. I pay tribute to the work she and others have done. And of course I'll give way. And then
grateful to the Health Secretary for giving way. And here's a representation from a Jonathan from Leicester. Can he, further to the question from the Chair of the Health Select Committee, can he confirm that in the spending review next year, that the cuts that we have seen to capital budgets, the £700 million worth of cuts we've seen to public health budgets, will be reversed, and that capital, training and public health will see real terms increases? Can he guarantee that?
No. The spending review is next year. What I can guarantee is a £20.5 billion increase in NHS spending. It is the biggest increase in any spending commitment for any public service in the history of this country. And it's a pity that the Leader of the Opposition isn't interested and doesn't want to hear about it. But if he stayed, he could hear also about the reforms that we're going to make.
and he should hear this more than anyone, we are acutely aware on this side of the House that this is not government money, it's not NHS money, this is the hard-earned money from taxpayers, and we need to make sure that it's spent wisely. And when he sprays his commitments around, the front bench opposite would do well to remember that this is the money from taxpayers.
Of course, I'll give that.
May I just welcome that taxpayers' money will be spread across the whole country, including in £10 million to support air ambulances, which provide such vital services in rural areas?
Well, so many of us know just how important the air ambulance services are and the countless lives that they save, and I'm delighted that there was extra money also on top of the 20.5 billion, the biggest ever, longest ever cash settlement for any public service in history. There was also 10 million for the air ambulances, and I'll give way up there.
I thank the Honourable Woman for giving way. If you'll excuse another Leicestershire-based health intervention, I'm incredibly grateful for the intervention and the creation of the new Cottage Hospital in Market Harborough, the gleaming new A&E ward in Leicester Royal Infirmary, and the decision to save the brilliant Children's Heart Unit at Glenfield. Does the Honourable Minister agree with me this is a more welcome record than the opposite party's record, which was of bankrupting the country, giving its biggest recession since the Second World War, and putting 1 million people on the dole?
Well, it is true that the economic record in office of the Labour Party has been always to leave unemployment higher than they found it. And it is true that while they left the deficit higher, we are bringing the deficit down. And it's true that inequality too is coming down. And it's true, on page 8 of the distributional analysis, that contrary to what we heard in that paean of gloom from the Shadow Chancellor, is that the biggest rises in full-term employee gross weekly real earnings over the last 3 years, the biggest rises have been amongst the 10% least well-paid in our country. That is what this Conservative government is doing, delivering for everybody in our country, and I'll give way.
Grateful. In relation to what he was mentioning about inequalities, does he recognise that under his government, life expectancy is stalling? In some regions it's going worse. For women it's going worse. And perhaps he can answer the question he couldn't answer last week, is why we are seeing for the first time in 100 years that babies will not reach, 4 babies in 1,000 will not reach their first birthday.
Well, as she knows, life expectancy is increasing, and we're going to see an increasing... We are forecast to see an increasing number of people living into a good old age. Indeed, over the next 30 years, the number of people aged 75 and over is set to double. And this is a brilliant achievement, and it is in part down to the hard work of our NHS. Cancer survival rates are at a record high, strokes are down by 1/3, deaths from heart failure are down by 1/4. Now, these successes, of course, have brought new challenges. The biggest health challenge we face is people are living longer, often with multiple chronic conditions. And the money is only one part of the plan to safeguard the NHS and ensure it's fit for the 21st century. And this budget delivers the funding, and later this year we'll deliver the plan for how we'll set fair the NHS for the future. I'll give way and then...
Well, I have very little hope for the older people of our country when they've cut £7 billion from the social care budget and only replaced it with £240 million. How is that safeguarding our old people for the future?
Well, of course, in Scotland, social care is devolved. So it's a... And in York, and in York, the amount of social care money is going up thanks to the decisions yesterday.
Isn't it true that Labour talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk? They failed to deliver an effective long-term solution to social care when they were in government. They had 13 years to sort it, and they didn't. And isn't it true that even though they said they'd use the comprehensive spending review to address this, they left office without delivering? That's what they do time and again.
He's absolutely right. And the long-term plan needs to make sure that we both address the challenges of today, but also address the challenges of tomorrow. Dementia, obesity, the rise in mental ill health. And the long-term plan is going to set out how we're going to address and deliver these changes. Because we here, on this side, believe in an NHS free at the point of the use for everyone for the long term. And now, yes, of course.
I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for giving way. In my local hospital, the A&E is deeply loved, and I'm very grateful that it is staying, but it is still under a huge amount of pressure. And when I've been out at night with the emergency services, I've seen that if someone has an acute mental illness and needs a mental health bed, this means emergency services personnel have to stay with that person and then can't get on with other roles. Does he agree with me that this government's strong announcement about more funding for mental health will help the whole of the NHS to do more?
She is absolutely right. And, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we can only have a sustainable NHS also if the social care system is properly supported too, which is what I want to turn to now. Just a second. The Social Care Green Paper later this year is going to set out the options to meet the unprecedented demographic challenge. And what a challenge. 70% of those in residential care homes now have dementia. The number of people with dementia is set to rise from 850,000 today to over 1 million in less than a decade. The number of people of working age in need of care is rising and set to increase by almost half by 2035. Yet despite these pressures, 83% of adult social care settings are now rated good or outstanding by the CQC. It's the highest ever since assessments began. So we as a society need to address the pressures on social care so everyone can live in dignity and it's sustainable for the long term. The Green Paper will bring forward a range of proposals to reform our social care system. And I want to pay tribute to the excellent cross-party work of the Health and Social Care Committee and the Communities Select Committee, who are helping to build a consensus behind potential solutions. This is exactly the sort of long-term cross-party work we need to see. When fair-minded people from across the House come together to address the challenges of the future, and I will work with anyone from any party to get this right. I'll give way.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. I listened with care to his very welcome remarks on yesterday's Today programme about giving parity of esteem between mental health and physical health. And I welcome the announcement in the budget of £250,000 for a child crisis centres. But in order to make this work, and what we're sadly seeing in society at the moment is people with complex mental health problems at a younger and younger age, in order to make these policies work, will he ensure that there are sufficiently number of well-trained staff in the NHS to deal with these mental health problems?
Absolutely right. He's put his finger on an incredibly important point. And as we spend £20 billion extra on the NHS, so we're going to make sure we train up and attract the people who are going to do the caring.
Right honourable gentleman for giving way. And on the issue of mental health support and services for children, one thing that I was quite disappointed that was missing from the budget is the mental health support for schools. There was a lot of money promised for CAMS, but as you'll know, the Education Select Committee did a joint report with the Health Committee on the Green Paper for mental health for children called Failing a Generation. And one of the things we were really keen to see was additional funding for mental health support in schools. Is there anything the Minister can do to look again at that issue? Yeah.
Yes, that is part of the £2 billion extra for mental health funding that we announced yesterday. Goes to ensure that the support in schools and for young people in particular, that is one of the elements of the funding that we announced in the budget yesterday. I'm very happy to talk to her with more details. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Social Care Green Paper is going to address the question of long-term funding reform for social care and how we can help people to plan sensibly so they don't have to fear the risk of losing everything. But the Green Paper will not just look at funding. It'll look, for example, at the role of housing too, how we can combine a home with high-quality care and the links between the care for children and the care of the elderly. I've seen how it can benefit both helping children's development and tackling the scourge of loneliness that elderly people face too often. And the Green Paper will, of course, also look at how we can better integrate the NHS and the social care system. Mr. Deputy Speaker, what matters is what works. So we'll look at things like auto-enrolment and how and if reforms elsewhere can be applied to social care, because like the NHS, the future of our social care system rests not just on funding but on reform, and we're determined to rise to this challenge. Now, every member of this House will have their own personal story of the NHS, and whether it was the first few breaths of a child or the final few moments of a loved one, from cradle to grave, that care is ever present, whatever the shade of government. And this government wants to ensure that care will always be there for whoever needs it, and that the NHS remains free at the point of delivery. That's why we're putting the extra £20 billion into the NHS. And it's only because our economy is strong, because employment is rising, it's only because we believe in a free market economy that we can fund this increase. For just as there can only be truth when there is freedom of speech, so there can only be prosperity to fund public services when there's freedom of enterprise. And it's a great sadness that, in stark contrast with the greats in his party in the past, the right honourable gentleman opposes both. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it's now a combination you can only get under a progressive, optimistic, future-focused Conservative government. That's what this budget delivers, and I commend the budget to the House.
Kirsty Blackman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it's an honour to speak for the SNP in the second day of the 2018 budget debate. 10 years ago last month, Lehman Brothers collapsed. Excessive risk-taking by financial institutions created an international banking crisis. A global downturn followed. Mr. Deputy Speaker, since then, people and families across the UK have had to pay for the fallout. There's been a decade of wage stagnation, a decade of cuts, a decade of the most vulnerable in our society being hit the hardest by Tory austerity. And looking forward, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we are staring into the abyss that is Brexit. Mark Carney says that Brexit's cost householders £900 on average already. And the Fraser-Vallender Institute estimates that leaving the single market and customs union would cost 80,000 Scottish jobs. After a decade of austerity, households could not afford to lose £900 each, and they certainly cannot afford a Tory Brexit. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the reality is that the people of Scotland are badly served by Westminster. We did not vote for a Tory government, and we did not vote for Brexit. I cannot think of a time in the past where a country has committed such a foreseeable act of economic self-harm.
Absolutely.
The Chancellor doesn't believe that we'll be better off after Brexit. The Prime Minister doesn't even believe that we'll be better off after Brexit. We were promised £350 million a week for public services. We won't be bought off with a commemorative 50p coin.
Yeah. I'm grateful for Lady Gingway. She made an excellent start to her speech. Does she agree with me that after a decade of Lehman austerity, we could be facing a decade of Brexit austerity?
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. I think the economic catastrophe that is coming down the line as a result of Brexit, and it doesn't matter if there's any Brexit is bad for the economy. Staying in the EU is the best possible option for the economy. If we can't stay in the EU, then staying in the single market and the customs union is the second best option in relation to the economy.
Further to that point, I wanted the Honourable Lady notice in the Red Book that the expected growth the UK will achieve in the next 4 to 5 years equals that of Ireland in only 1 year. And isn't that an example, the clear signpost that should be given to all in Scotland and elsewhere, that independence has worked for Ireland and is going to work for Scotland. And the sooner we get it, and the sooner we're clear of this lot, the better.
Absolutely. It's clear that for Scotland's economy, remaining part of the UK is bad for Scotland's economy. If you look at the comparators in the budget information that's provided, actually the UK economy is growing slower than the EU economy is set to grow in every but one of the next 5 years in the books that there are. Absolutely.
Could I just ask whether the Honourable Lady has ever seen the result of a referendum that she likes?
She will soon. She will soon. Scottish Parliament.
Do you know what? The reality is that we have argued for a very long time. I've argued my entire adult life against the democratic system that we currently have because it does not work for the people of Scotland. We do not get the governments that we vote for. We do not get the results in the EU referendum that we voted for. So actually, if the democratic system meant that Scotland's votes were reflected in reality, then we would be in a very different situation today.
Ireland gets what it wants.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, on a serious note, in our communities and at our surgeries, MPs across the House are faced weekly with the consequences of Westminster's poor decisions. We see working mothers forced to go to food banks.
Correct.
We see and hear about the Home Office enforced separation of families.
Absolutely awful.
We meet young men struggling with mental health problems who have been sanctioned yet again because of their inability to jump through unreasonable hoops put in their way by the DWP. I don't know how anybody, even in this Westminster government, can believe that their policies are having a positive benefit. The tears and desperation that all of us are faced with on a regular basis give the lie to this notion. The Chancellor has failed to adequately fund our public services in this budget. He has failed to undo the devastating social security cuts. He has failed to legislate for a real living wage. And he's failed to provide adequate support for businesses who are faced with the impending cliff edge of Brexit. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the budget needed to make decisions to help and support all of those who've been hit by a decade of austerity and all of those who will be hit by the forthcoming Brexit. In social security, the rollout of universal credit should have been halted. A third of working-age households will be entitled to some universal credit. Of those, around one-third will be at least £1,000 a year worse off under universal credit than under the legacy system.
Will Honourable Friend give way?
Yes, I will.
Thank you. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Does she agree that there was a missed opportunity in the budget yesterday not only to correct the injustices of universal credit, but to compensate those, like the Highland Council, who have found themselves having to foot a £2.5 million bill out of council taxpayers' funds simply for administering this failed and shambolic universal credit rollout?
Absolutely, and Highland Council and the area have been particularly badly hit as one of the first areas that was part of the rollout. It's currently rolling out in Aberdeen just now, and I am really hugely concerned about the impact that it will have on my constituents as the rollout happened, and that's why it needs to be halted, because the issues that happened in Highlands and that have happened elsewhere have not been fixed, and they need to be fixed before any further rollout can occur. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the benefits freeze should have been lifted. The sanctions regime should be scrapped. Support for lone parents under the age of 25 must be reintroduced. And the WASPI issue must be sorted, with women being given money that they are owed. And the government now, I'm pleased that it's made a commitment to the pensions dashboard, but it now needs to actually legislate to compel companies to comply in order that people can access the information about the pensions that they are owed and that they can then get the pensions that they are owed as a result. I think that's a really important thing that lots of people have been calling for. Mr. Deputy Speaker, on workers' rights, which is another reserved issue, the Chancellor should have committed to increasing the minimum wage to the living wage by the end of this Parliament, an amount that people can actually live on. This week, the ONS has said that among the countries of the UK, long-term pay growth has been highest in Scotland. Median pay for full-time workers was 87% higher in Scotland this year than it was in 1997. The Scottish Government is doing all it can, particularly where staff are employed in public sector roles, but we need the powers to do more. In Scotland, our government has focused on uplifting the pay packets of those who are lowest paid. That is a progressive choice that makes the most positive difference. The UK Government have not chosen to do this. We have fought long and hard for there to be a single real living wage rate. It does not cost less to live when you are 24 than when you are 25. And the UK Government needs to recognise this. If the Chancellor won't make the required commitments to a real living wage for all, he should devolve it so that we can. Statutory paternity leave should be doubled from 2 to 4 weeks, giving fathers even more opportunity to bond with their babies. And a complete review of parental leave should be undertaken, including considering the start date of maternity leave, especially when a baby is born prematurely. We propose that the government sets up a Labour participation committee to look at groups that are currently underrepresented or in fact overrepresented in certain sectors, examining barriers to work for women, for disabled people, for parents and for other marginalised groups. Mr Deputy Speaker, moving on to businesses. The IOD has called for a pot to be set aside for SMEs to bid into so that they can get advice on how to cope with Brexit. The UK Government's advice thus far has been wholly inadequate. We've only got 5 months to go until the UK crashes out of the EU. It is necessary for businesses to be able to access the finance in order to grow. And to do this, they need to have trust in financial institutions and, crucially, financial institutions need to earn this trust. Indeed. The Chancellor should have committed to setting up a tribunal service so that those affected by business banking fraud through RBS GRG, Lloyds, HBOS or others can seek affordable redress rather than having to go through a court process that's too expensive to access.
Top idea.
The UK Government must also ensure that current EU funding will continue until the end of the current multi-annual financial framework. Scotland must not be any worse off in respect of funding allocations that replace those provided from the EU, and any arrangements must fully respect devolution and must be put in place with the consultation and with the agreement of the Scottish Parliament. In oil and gas, the Chancellor had the opportunity to make a commitment to the oil and gas sector, to the sector deal, and he failed to do so. Our industry needs this to be signed off now, particularly with the impending lack of access to labour and investment that Brexit will bring. I'm pleased that the Chancellor has heeded calls to make a clear statement on the funding on the future fiscal regime, because we cannot have unforeseen sudden tax hikes like previous Chancellors have made. And the other part of the jigsaw that's missing is a commitment to reducing the harmful climate change effects of the use of fossil fuels. In 2015, the UK Government cancelled its £1 billion carbon capture storage competition just 6 months before it was due to be awarded, after spending £100 million on it, and that left Peterhead, a key candidate for support, behind. That's 3 years of research and development into this vital industry of the future that we've missed out on. The UK Government needs to make an unequivocal commitment to supporting the development of CCS. Yes.
I'm grateful for my honourable friend for giving way. She's made a very powerful point about carbon capture and the betrayal of the £1 billion project at Peterhead. But does she agree with me that if the UK Government are serious about meeting the climate change targets under the Paris Agreement, spending £100 million now, when you're behind the pace after 3 years of abandoning a £1 billion project, is just not good enough?
Absolutely. I think the potential benefits of CCS are unquestionable, and actually, as my honourable friend says, we need to get back ahead of that curve. We need to put the money in now, and we need the UK Government to commit to doing that. And it's especially important because of the lack of trust that they now have with those companies who are developing CCS because of that previous pulling the plug. So they need to make a real, clear, unequivocal commitment. Still on evolving technologies such as tidal, Scotland's a global leader in tidal. And the UK Government must work with the Scottish Government around the CFD process so that it can change to support technology journey from development to commercialisation, which is particularly important with tidal. And on solar power, we have been contacted by so many individuals concerned about what's happening, about the export tariff for homes, small businesses and community energy projects from next April. It's a vital support, and it encourages people to invest in solar power, and it must continue. And lastly, around climate change. In order to reduce climate change and increase the use of healthier methods of transport, this budget was an opportunity to reduce VAT on bikes. Just as we would like to see the VAT removed on digital books, reducing VAT on bikes would make it cheaper for all, and it would be a real statement of intent from the government to reduce climate change.
Is the member not aware that reducing VAT is very difficult when you're a member of the European Union, and only something that we might be able to do after we leave after Brexit?
Actually, reducing VAT is quite possible when you're a member of the EU. Zero rating things is a problem. Reducing VAT is actually fine to do when you're in the EU. Looking specifically at Scotland's public finances and Scotland's finances, the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service and Police Scotland are still owed £175 million in VAT.
Where's the money?
The UK Government has recognised that the system it had in place was unfair, yet it has refused to pay back the £175 million that it owes our two vital life-saving industries. If they could see their way to giving us back that £175 million, that would be incredibly useful.
Yeah, cough up.
And also on the subject of the UK government reallocating funds that should rightfully have gone to Scotland, the convergence uplift of £160 million should have been paid to Scottish farmers, and the Secretary of State for the Environment admitted that this money had been spent elsewhere. We need this money in future years to come to Scotland. We need a commitment for that, and we need the previous year's money to come to Scotland now, so that our farmers can have the cash that they have been allocated. In digital tax, I'm really pleased that the budget's included measures to ensure that companies pay their fair share of tax in this sphere. The reality, though, is this is a consultation and that the measures are not going to be in place yet, and actually that we don't have a solid idea on what those measures will be. The SNP would like to propose two things around measures on digital taxation, and we hope that the Government will take those into account. Firstly, we believe that online retailers should be held liable for tax fraud committed by their suppliers. Sometimes when you order a product from a well-known online retailer, it is delivered from China with a customs declaration and a stamp that says gift. Large online retailers should be held responsible for ensuring that those who use their platform pay the correct customs duties. We also believe that in order to combat tech firms avoiding corporation tax by registering implausibly low UK profits, the Chancellor should levy corporation tax on an assumed UK share of worldwide profits that is equal to their UK share of worldwide revenue. This could be subject to a dispute tribunal process to ensure fairness. Going forward in the consultation process, the SNP will submit these suggestions in the consultation process, and we hope that they will be considered seriously. Mr Deputy Speaker, Scotland's cities have received City Deal funding from both the UK and the Scottish governments. This is welcome, but what's not welcome is the fact that the UK government has contributed far less to those city deals than the Scottish government. In total, the Tories have failed to match over £350 million of Scottish government funding for city deals and growth deals in Glasgow, Aberdeen, Inverness, Stirling and Clackmannanshire, Tay cities and Edinburgh. We believe that they should match our contribution, and we believe they should call on the Chancellor to make that commitment, as well as fulfilling the Chief Secretary of the Treasury's commitment to provide each part of Scotland with a regional deal. In an ask on the NHS that would require only a small financial contribution, but would have significant positive benefits, the UK Government could have used this budget to follow Scotland's lead on PrEP, that's pre-exposure prophylaxis. In Scotland, PrEP is available on the NHS. England has been dragging their heels about making this available on the NHS. But the benefits in the reduction of new cases of HIV are unchallengeable, and it is not fair that those in England cannot currently access the drug on the NHS. So that change would not cost a huge amount of money, but would make a massive difference to people's lives.